I'm delighted to welcome everybody who's here in London and everyone who's joining us online to today's Big Respect in the Energy Sector event, which National Grid is hosting in conjunction with Pride in Energy. And it's part of our programme of events for Global Inclusion Week, which we run every year here at National Grid. And I'm pleased to be joined by Juergen Maier, a trailblazing leader in the UK industry, chairman of Great British Energy, a former chief executive of Siemens UK, and a passionate advocate for inclusion. We're going to kick off our session this morning with a bit of a fireside chat, where we're going to hear about Juergen's personal journey as a gay man in the energy and industrial sectors, hear some of his thoughts on how we can build a more inclusive future for LGBT+ professionals in the industry. And then we'll be joined by some of our National Grid colleagues, and we'll have a broader conversation about promoting inclusion and creating big respect in the energy sector, and how we can all take steps to help make the sector as welcoming as possible. So Juergen, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Maybe we could start with a bit of your story. You've spoken about not being out about your sexual orientation for 20 years whilst you were at Siemens. What was it like carrying that weight whilst leading such a high-profile organisation?
Yeah, well, first of all, great to be here, Rob, and great to be with all of you. It feels a bit weird being in the room next door to you all, but I am here, and I think after we've had this fireside chat and the panel, I'll be mingling out and about as well, so we can make it a bit more personal as well, which will be nice. But back to your question. I mean, first of all, when I joined Siemens as a graduate in 1986, and I actually did my first industrial placement with in 1984. I mean, things were very different. That said, we're moving into a place that is more uncomfortable than where we had made progress to, and sort of in the 1980s, remember this was, we were in the sort of the middle of the HIV pandemic. I mean, the minute, somebody found out you were gay, it wasn't just something that wasn't talked about. It was, there was a real stigma attached to it. But, I don't need to explain that in this room. We've all watched It's a Sin, which played back that scenario very well. So to be honest with you, to me, it was just blindingly obvious that I would not out myself at work. And we were just used to living double lives. And so I'll be honest with you, at the time, it wasn't a big issue to me. This is just what you do. And if you want to get on, you sort of go with the flow. So, so interested. Now I reflect back on it. And of course, I have done a lot, especially as I've changed and as I've helped drive inclusion within organizations. I mean, there's two things. One is it was Siemens that was missing out. And Siemens was missing out because, I came to work to be somebody who I wasn't. And I was sort of conforming to what I thought was the style that would help me progress in my career, which at the time was, you needed to be a bit of a sort of a more alpha male, So I lived this sort of, at work, I was this sort of quite alpha male type, because that's what Siemens was signaling to me is what you needed to be to get on, So Siemens was missing out. And of course, I'm sure we'll get on about talking about, why it's important that organizations don't miss out on that inclusivity. I mean, the other thing in hindsight, especially as my career progressed, it was getting more difficult to lead this sort of double life. In the meantime, I had a long-term partner. You were going along to events, and you were always having to explain why you were on your own. And and in hindsight, it did have quite an effect on my mental health. I didn't realise it was having that effect on my mental health, but it did. So there was no way it would have been able to have something that was sustainable. And by the way, and I think it might have been 18 years in, but about 20 years in was that sort of right. It's time to make it obvious. By the way, most people knew by that point. How can you live, as you sort of progress and you become more senior, you live in Manchester, how can you keep something like that, totally secret?
And what was it that gave you that confidence to take that brave step to, after 18 years in that environment that, as you say, is kind of alpha male, society is maybe very different to how it is today? What was it that kind of gave you that confidence to take that step?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's three things. One is you gain in your own confidence. So throughout that period leading up to, let's say my more senior appointment, I like most people, but certainly people who are from less represented backgrounds, we do suffer that sort of imposter syndrome. We do suffer that, am I good enough? And my God, I'm a gay man, and and am I almost worthy of being able to do these more? So you have that self-doubt, that self-questioning mind, but over time, you sort of learn, well, actually, my style seems to be going down quite well. Slowly, you start to experiment with just showing a bit of your difference. And I was learning that actually people are taking to this quite nicely. So your own confidence grows, because you're hopefully sort of creating some success in the businesses that you're involved with, or get the chance of leading in your organization. That was one thing. I think the second very important thing is that society and Siemens was on a change. So we're now sort of into the 2000s, early 2000s, and this real push of diversity and inclusion, and it was beginning to happen, and it was becoming, in some ways it was a trend, which you can argue it should be more than a trend, and of course it should be, but companies wanted to get on this bandwagon. So I suddenly thought, well, here's an opportunity for me. I can help Siemens. I'm now in a leadership position. So why shouldn't I use my difference and help Siemens? And that was the second thing. And then the third thing was, it was just becoming blindingly obvious that there was a business need, and I think, and it's very important. To emphasize that, it was just, at Siemens, it was, look, we're not as innovative as we were. We're not as fast as we were. We're struggling to recruit the right talent. Well, inclusive teams are at least part of the answer of solving that problem. So there were sort of these three things that came together, that allowed me to change. Well, not change who I was, to become who I always was.
It's really interesting listening to you describe it as a bit of a journey. I think people often say, "Oh, when did you come out?" But actually, it's not a one-off event. It's a journey. It's a thing that keeps happening. It's really interesting. You talked a bit about some of the business benefits of an inclusive culture and what you did at Siemens to help change how that organisation worked. What were the kind of most effective steps or changes or things that you did within Siemens to create that more inclusive culture where people could bring their whole selves to work and really be themselves?
Well, I think the most effective way and the fastest way of driving this sort of change is if you're lucky enough and you can drive it from the top down. Now for that you need a chief executive, or at least sponsorship at sort of board level, to make that happen. And at Siemens we hadn't had that before, and So I was able to bring that change. So, and we very visibly brought that change from the top. I was also able to win an ally and support from the main board. So I was in charge of Siemens in the UK. But on our main board, we just happened to have recruited a new black woman into our head of people and culture, and she was a very strong ally of the LGBT community too, and a woman called Janina Kugel, and and then we found a few other allies in a few other countries, and we really drove it from the top, and then the rest almost starts to happen automatically, because what you then need is you need the groundswell of the bottom up. You just sort of, from the top, you just give permission. And I know that, at National Grid, you've had a great champion of that with, John Pettigrew and other members of your board. And, so you need that permission, and then you get the groundswell of the bottom up and the creation of the networks and, the unconscious bias training and, just emerging everybody in, the language and the change and taking people with you. And I think the point at which that it's really working is when you see managers or leaders who have been quite obstructive in this journey, either leave the organization or, even better, visibly change. I had many scenarios, where I had sort of, leaders almost have their coming out moment. And I'm talking here about, straight, white men, sort of standing in front of an audience and sort of, saying, look, I'm going to tell you that, I'm seeing the world differently. And, can you please forgive me, for some of the behavior, some of the comments I might have made in the past. I am a champion of inclusion, and those become your best allies. If you can create, and it was, and we had a few of those moments, and the organization just visibly changes.
It must have been so incredible to see that transformation and that how visible leadership from one person just gets amplified and amplified once you get that kind of cohort of allies.
Indeed.
And allyship is hugely important. What do you think people should think about doing to move from just a kind of performative, I'm an ally, support inclusion, into kind of maybe more active things that people can do to create the right culture that fosters inclusion?
Well, I think it's pretty much what I described, isn't it? You've got to create that organisation and that culture where, that sort of performative support, just gets called out, and people recognise it, and people don't appreciate it, and and it's exactly those sorts of people. Look, at my experience was that 80% of people will change. If that is what the organisation absolutely says we are becoming and we want to be, then most of the people will change. They need help, they need support. And remember, and I often say this to people also in my private life, in many ways, we are lucky as people from less representative backgrounds because, we came into a world that is not binary. We came into a world where we are different to this. You're either straight or you're, and you're a woman, a man, etc. Whereas we're in a world where we understand these shades of grey, and we've learned over time that non-binary, and we've got all these, and we meet these people, we in our social settings, we win these people. Now, if you're a typical straight white man, you're rarely confronted with this stuff. And actually, the world has got so complicated that you quite like things to just be binary. And so, these people have not had to think about, and don't want to think about it, which is, of course, also what the populists are preying on. The populists are preying, look, all these horrible woke people that are all in this room next door here today, we're just trying to make this world muddy and complicated for people, and it's all wrong, and I'm going to keep it binary for you, and so what I'm really saying is, we're lucky to live in this non-binary world, and my experience has been, and honestly, the amount of managers, senior managers, that have come to me and said, Juergen, you opened my eyes, with these new experiences, with this training that we did, of how to, we did training on just language, because for a lot of straight white people, to go into a room like this and to, talk about trans issues, to talk about non-binary issues, to talk about pronouns, they don't know what language to use. So, we've got to help these people along. So I'm sort of waffling on a little bit, but I'm saying, look, you've just got to create the culture where you help as much as possible. Most people eventually come. Those that don't come, they get called out and they leave your organization.
Yeah. You talked about maybe the increasingly difficult world in which we live in the rise of populism, in sentiment against the DEI agenda, people not being maybe feeling so easy to talk about this topic and to push it and to promote an inclusive environment. What do you think organisations should think about doing in that increasingly difficult world to make sure that we continue to do the right thing and to focus on creating inclusive workplaces and protecting everybody who works in our organisations?
Yeah, look, it's such an important question, and we are in a difficult place. That said, this journey has been going on for over 100 years, and we've made a lot of progress. And in that journey of progress, you're going to have periods, and sadly, this one has been going on for a little bit too long now. But even if it's a decade in that whole period where we stall, where we go backwards a little bit, I'm confident that we will come out the other side and make progress again. So I just sort of see this as the bad decade. Now, what do we as business people have to do in that time? Well, the first thing we have to do is stay focused on what is good for our business. And what's good for our business is to continue to drive inclusive cultures. As a matter of fact, if you take the energy industry and the energy transition, it's the opportunity to change our country, but it's the opportunity to change cultures. The oil and gas industry, which I think we should embrace as part of this journey, but they've come from a very sort of, male-orientated, less inclusive background. Well, here we have an opportunity to take the industry to something that will look much more inclusive and therefore, will also be more innovative and more fun to work in, etc., etc. So look, we've got to stay focused on doing the right thing. I do think we have to be selective in what conversations we hold where, and I have changed my mind on that. I'm somebody who always says call everything out and whatever, but I think we just have to find ways of just playing the smart and playing the long game here. Internally, just keep doing the right thing. Externally, when you've got certain anti-people in the room, you just play the game. We've got President Trump coming here this week, and I'm finding it, quite fascinating and quite smart that what we're talking about is the things that President Trump likes to talk about, which is nuclear power, which is data centers, which is AI, and all the rest of it. And look, the rest of it, we're just going to get on with. We're going to decarbonize. We love our windmills, and we love diversity and inclusion.
I'm reminded of the Statkraft advert about wind turbines, which is a hilarious kind of take on. We're going to take the argument to them, but it's interesting to hear your view that maybe that's not always the right way, and thinking carefully about how organisations kind of tread the kind of difficult years ahead, I think is wise counsel.
Now, look, if it comes up in conversation, don't compromise your values. Now find a smart way of doing that. But, exactly your point, don't don't take the argument to Goliath, because, it just amplifies the rhetoric. It helps divide. It creates the wrong debate. But stay true to your values in the moment, and absolutely within our organizations, continue to drive the right agenda.
Yeah, 100% agree. And thinking about the energy sector, large field forces, maybe kind of from a more traditional background in certain areas, what do you think are the biggest blind spots in the sector about LGBT plus inclusion?
Well, the biggest blind spot is sort of what I said before, which is that, really this energy transition, is a gift for the energy sector to transform itself, to need to transform itself, to be much more inclusive than it has been historically. And at Siemens, I used to stand up and openly say to our teams and say, look, we're in a skills competition. We're trying to attract the best skills to our organization. But actually, if you look at where Siemens had been historically, you were fishing in a pond of, maybe 40% of the population. We'd sort of counted out anybody from the LGBT community, whatever that is, 8-10%. We were not actively really making ourselves attractive to women to come and work in our engineering environments. Obviously, another 50%. Yeah. Then we weren't brilliant at attracting people with disabilities of all sorts, so I mean, we were sort of just fishing in a ridiculously small pool, and so if you're really going to take talent seriously, it's got to be totally inclusive just from an attraction point of view. But secondly, renewable energy is genuinely a place where people want to come and work, much more so than they did in an oil and gas or a fossil fuel driven industry. And I do think we don't tell that story enough, how renewable energy is a place where people genuinely want to come and work, and it's fun, and we're changing the world for the better. People believe in the purpose. So I think we need to tell that story much more.
Yeah, I agree. It's really interesting how even in my time I've seen a change in the demographic, a change in how people think about the energy sector, and it being the exciting, vibrant, attractive place.
It is changing.
I'm enjoying too.
It is changing, which is great. And events like this help, powerful women, and all of these, initiatives are all great events to help with that.
Maybe if we zoom out one more from kind of the energy sector to think about global organizations, you talked about how you built and found kind of a network of allies within Siemens organization operating all over the world, all sorts of different cultures. What was your experience of promoting LGBT advocacy and inclusive environment in that kind of global environment in an organization that's dealing with very different cultures and different sets of beliefs?
Well, to be honest with you, and again, we have to frame it that we were in a slightly different time to where we are now. We were sort of in the 2000s, people were wanting to get on the bandwagon. There was a lot of global chief executives that, didn't have the language, didn't quite know how to do this. I remember being invited into boardrooms of colleagues, for me to talk to their boards about what we were doing, because, so I sort of, I made my difference sort of became my strength. So whereas my difference previously was something sort of hidden, and I left literally at the door when I walked through into work, it now became my strength. It became my USP in many ways. And so look, I mean, I mostly, even from people who didn't really understand how to go about it, I was finding lots of allies across the whole industry and sector. Occasionally, you came across people, who just, didn't get it, didn't want to come on the journey, and all the rest of it. And sadly, the current climate is giving some oxygen to those sorts of leaders again. Having said that, I was just chatting with Josh and looking at the research that has been done as part of this this session we're talking about here, and we were both saying it was actually quite heartening to see that the amount of discrimination or the amount of people who feel like they've been overtly discriminated or even mistreated as an LGBT individual, it's risen slightly, but it hasn't actually gone up dramatically. And I suspect that in society at large, it's rising faster than it is within workplaces. And I think that is because most workplaces have stayed true to this agenda, despite needing to message something maybe slightly different, but have stayed true and have basically continued to create safe spaces for their people. Now, I caveat that with there are some organisations who haven't, we will find our ways of calling them out. And I think what will ultimately call them out is the fact that they will just perform less well than those who stay true to the agenda.
Exactly. I was about to say exactly that they will be the ones that may be expedient right now, but in the long term, they will be the ones that be suffering rather than other organisations.
It's not a clever strategy, is it? There is a war on talent, and if you're painting over the top of your door, I'm no longer inclusive, well, you're doing exactly what I said, we changed at Siemens. You're narrowing the field from which you can recruit, and actually you're going to create a pretty toxic climate in which not a lot of people want to work in.
You won't even bring them in, and if you did manage to bring them in, you're going to cripple your talent. They can't be themselves. They can't be.
They're going to last for long, are they?
Not when you're trying to mask yourself and, as you say, leave half of yourself at the door, that they're going to be able to perform. So I've got maybe one more for you before we invite the rest of the panel in to join us. What advice would you give to a young LGBT plus professional joining the energy sector today?
Well, there's two things, and one is, just think about the excitement of what we're doing, and despite some of the highly charged political rhetoric about the energy transition, be proud of the fact that you're on the right side of history, and that in 10 or 20 years' time we will all look back and be proud that we did the right thing, and it's an exciting industry to be working in. So that's point number one, and point number two, I think, is make your difference your strength. Your difference isn't your weakness, and work on that, on what exactly that means. And and it's easy to say these things, isn't it? I think I made my difference my strength. In the end, it took me a while, and look, I hope nobody takes 20 years to make their difference their strength, but it's okay to work at it for a while. And it's a bit like you said, it's not here I am and I'm out and I'm going to be different, and it's a journey at working out how your difference makes you effective at whatever you're doing at work.
Very good advice. Thank you very much, Juergen. If I invite maybe now my National Grid colleagues to join us, and we'll widen out for a panel conversation. Josh, others, do you want to come in?
All right, the audience are still with us. Hello, everybody out
there. There we go. Perfect.
Hello.
Hello.
We just grab.
Just come and I think we've got three at the front. Breathe by. There we go.
Shall I go here?
Yeah, thanks, Cordi.
It's really nice out there as well with the crowd.
Perfect. It's a slightly strange setup, but it is enabling us to broadcast this and to also record it for our colleagues in the States, which will be an excellent. Right, so thank you very much. Joined with about three of my colleagues here from National Grid. Maybe I'll ask each of you to introduce yourselves in turn and to give us a short few words about what drives you to be passionate about inclusion. Cordi, I'll start with you.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. It's brilliant to be here and on this lovely panel. I'm president of National Grid Electricity Distribution, and I've been in National Grid nearly 12 years. And I'm passionate about inclusion for two reasons, really. One, it's really personal. I know what it's like to feel excluded. I felt the pain of that as a young northern woman from a mining town joining a commodities trading business and thinking, how the hell am I going to fit into here without wearing pinstripe suits and cufflinks and becoming a man? And
I was like, yeah, no cufflinks.
I know what it feels like, and I didn't like that feeling. I never want anybody to feel like that in my team. And secondly, I think it's what Juergen said earlier. I mean, it's just good business sense. Every business who creates these contexts and environments attracts the best talent, is the most innovative, creates the best product set for their customers, represents their community issues better. It's just really good for business, and that's important too.
Cool. Thank you. Abbie.
Good morning, everyone. Abbie Badcock-Broe. I am Head of Corporate UK and Decarbonisation Strategy at National Grid Group, which is within our Strategy and Regulation Group function. I've been at National Grid for 5 years now, and I think on that passion piece, it's a wonderful culmination for me for two things I'm really passionate about. So I stumbled into the sector 18 years ago. I've worked across renewables, energy retail, infrastructure, system operations, and again, picking up from Juergen's point, when you look at what we have to accomplish for this century ahead to avoid catastrophic temperatures that does not leave our world in a better place, we really need to tap into creativity. And that means really bringing everybody's ideas to be able to solve this, because we've not been through this scale of a challenge beforehand. So we have to make sure that those who perhaps aren't in those rooms of decision making are able to get their ideas to permeate up. And then the second one is, it comes back to something that Cordi was saying. It's a personal point for me. Since I was a very small child, I wanted to help others. And now as I've grown into a leadership place, but still feeling those levels of imposter syndrome of going, am I a leader now? I never considered myself to be in leadership. To then say, how can I help others' voices to be amplified when perhaps they don't have the confidence to do that?
Cool. Thanks, Abbie. Josh.
Thanks. I'm Joshua Atkins. I'm the UK Head of Corporate Affairs for National Grid Ventures. So I look after all the external activity we do for our interconnected fleets and green LNG now. I've also been running Pride and Energy for nearly 8 years, and we're kind of a cross-industry LGBTQ plus network, which I think many of our members are on the line or in the room, which is great, as well as some of our committee actually. I think in terms of what drives me, everyone has kind of said a lot of it already. I think for me, there's the kind of duality of frustration and optimism. I think there's a frustration, the points I think a lot of you made already, that people can't be themselves, companies can't achieve what they want to achieve. The kind of end goals of decarbonisation, all that kind of stuff is held back by that. But I think there's a degree of optimism that with companies and initiatives like ours and Power of Women and other networks as well are driving change and making companies on the sector more attractive, particularly to the individuals who want to work in it, in a employment marketplace where I think it is, Cordi probably knows better than anyone, that it's quite hard to attract engineers and other members of staff, and that a lot of people get poached and move countries, let alone sectors. So I think it's one of those things where if it's something that will make us an even more attractive business to work for, that it's something that we should do and other companies should do as well.
Cool. Thank you very much. Welcome, panel. So Juergen and I talked earlier on about the changing environment. The world is becoming more complicated. There is a notable backlash against people talking about diversity, equity and inclusion and some of the challenges. Maybe a two-part question for the rest of the panel. What worries you about that environment, but also what is it that gives you hope that you think actually is something as a sector we could focus on that could cut through some of the difficult world that we live in? And Josh, I might come to you first. You want to maybe talk about some of the Pride and Energy research as well to give us some kind of interesting insights on what's happening in the sector right now.
Sure. So Juergen did pitch some of this earlier in his remarks. We were talking about this before. It's fine. It's fine.
Benefits of going first.
You fed me the line.
I did. Well, I don't need to repeat it then, do I? But I think one of the things that we've noticed we've just completed our 5th survey, and a very similar pattern has emerged across all 5 of them, where our respondents' perceptions of the industry is very different to their perceptions of their employer. And most of them think their employer is a good place to work or a very good place to work, but then people think that the sector isn't necessarily. And I think there is this possibly false perception that the energy sector isn't as inclusive as it actually is. I'm not saying that there are bad apples or bad teams or bad corners, as there are in every industry and every part of society. But I think that's one of the areas, again, I have kind of a cause for optimism for kind of inclusion in the sector.
Cool. Cordi.
Yeah, worries. It's a really difficult time, and hearing and knowing that people feel more distressed than they've ever felt and feel a retraction of either rights or support is really difficult challenge as a leader. And what I've been proud about for National Grid and what we've done as an exec team is actually lean into the discussion. We didn't pull anything away. We didn't put the shutters up. We had really important discussion as the exec and the board about what really mattered and sticking to our values, not changing the words. We had a big debate about that. Is DEI still, it's a bit too toxic right now? Can we, actually no, because we're explaining other words that mean the same thing. But we're deciding which conversations to have where. I think we have to be smart and play the long game, Juergen. I think we do sense that, and who's in the room and what do we talk about there. But our environments are really secure, I hope, here. That's my belief and optimism. And my hope is, and I think you said it earlier, us continuing to invest in our own environments, not moving away from our values, never questioning the business case. We haven't. We'll keep moving forward when everyone else has to catch back up. But it's an awkward time when we've had maybe a louder, slightly different voice. And we've got to sort of navigate that together. And so we'll be reviewing as an exec all of the listening sessions that have just been going on across all the business and all the functions. And that gives me hope, because people have had those environments to share, and we will be more educated about what the next set of actions to take. But it's not easy.
Yeah. And I think, speaking from my experience as one of the co-sponsors for our Pride Network, I think the organisation welcomes that response and that very kind of thoughtful rather than reactive, immediate response. But you hear some of the conversations and some of the fear from some of our trans staff and in the US in particular, and it's really hard to listen to. Yes. And if I answer my own question, the thing that gives me hope is a focus on how we create belonging, create a sense of community, so that people know where we work is a safe place to be. Because when outside of your workplace you hear all sorts of negative rhetoric, actually whatever we can do to create those environments of safety for our staff is something that I just think is huge.
Those are the ones that we own.
Yeah, we can do something about that.
Yeah,
exactly. Abbie,
how much am I left with to be able to talk about? So I think the things that worry me are how all of these trends are now conflating. And it's not just the points around the actions that have happened since the Trump administration. And, those have been targeting DEI individuals, but not just the DEI community. If you look at what this means for immigration and how migrants themselves are actually feeling uncomfortable, visa sponsorships being pulled from corporates, that is actually a big concern when we come back to that talent pool, that we have become diminished. And this is a trend that we've seen for a long time, right? Last 10 years in the UK when we started on that Brexit journey, and what does that mean? So there are lots of things which, if you're then in a very negative mindset, if you've watched an apocalyptic type movie, it can feel very, very nihilistic. And I think the optimism comes back to the things that we can control. And I think that's what I am still hopeful for. I have young children, and I still think that things can be better. And I see that kindness, and I see that point of curiosity, which comes back to how you can respectfully understand people. And I think that is the common ground that is being lost by this populism and division, that actually, what is the sentiment that some extreme politicians are plugging into right now that the rest of us feel quite divorced from and quite fearful from? So that's the thing. I think it's then, how do we do that active listening to those who we may not share the same values with? Because I think sometimes when we have discussions online, it becomes very binary.
Yeah.
There is no grey. There is no tone. There is no other forms of communication. We are literally limited to, making assumptions and opinions. And I think a lot of the things which are happening externally at the moment is opinions are proving more important than fact. People are actually, convicted or guilty of something based on well, if there's smoke there's fire, and that is actually something that we need to counter against and sort of say, look, let's try and have a conversation, let's really try and understand a little bit more, and surely that is what the point of humanity is, to come together on.
A bit more listening to other people, thinking about their perspectives and actually engaging in a constructive, proactive way on what is a sensitive topic for many people.
And also on that inclusion point, when it's very different from ourselves, we like to align ourselves with people that we share some connection with or we have some commonality, and it's hard to do that when it's very, very different. And I think that's a skill that we need to be a lot more open to, because otherwise we risk ourselves being in groupthink and thinking things will continue a certain way without actually being tapped into what is happening externally or in other pockets.
Thanks. We heard before some of Juergen's perspectives on kind of the energy industry and the industrials industry, kind of what's changed in your career. Cordi, I might ask you this one.
Mm-hmm.
What's changed since the days of pinstripes and cufflinks?
And I did wear both, by the way. I'm now confident enough to wear a dress at work or a red jacket. Things have moved on.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
So what do you think has changed since
Yeah.
you joined the industry, and what do you think are the key barriers that still exist to inclusion in the sector?
I mean, there's been tremendous progress in understanding the business case, right, for diversity and inclusion. I laid that out earlier, and that's so welcome, and that has spirited organisations to have a purpose and clear vision and strategy to bring that to life. And people have set clear values, and the best organisations live by those values. And you've said do the right thing a number of times, and that's one of our values, Juergen. Yeah, and we celebrate that, and we attract a lot of people into our organisation because of our purpose. And we just wouldn't talk like that back in the 90s when I started. But the world is getting more complicated. Pace of change is accelerating, and the role of the leader is really changed from a very sort of hierarchical command control, I have the vision, thou shalt do, to this is a time for a leader who's curious, who's a convener, who values difference in a debate and a discussion, who doesn't want to have a singular view of the world and wants optionality scenarios. And that's brilliant, providing we can harness it. And the recent sort of challenges we've just been talking about, could stifle that. And it's actually the wrong moment, because it is the moment to have a really progressive, diverse energy sector that's solving the net zero challenge. So a lot has changed for the good, and there's still a lot to go. But if we can value what leaders need to do in this next phase and create those environments, the outcomes of representation, maybe I'm too optimistic. I think they come. Maybe I'm too optimistic. You can challenge it.
Optimism is good. Optimism is good on a Tuesday morning. We talked a little bit about the sector. I really love hearing people's stories. And I think people's stories can be really powerful. And we heard Juergen's really inspirational story about having the courage to be yourself at the top of the organisation and to lead change within Siemens. I wanted to maybe ask some of the others on the panel, and then maybe get your reflections, Juergen, on this. Tell us about a time when you've led inclusively, or you've benefited from somebody else's inclusive leadership that's enabled you to be who you are and to excel in the organisation.
Looking at me,
looking at you.
So this was one I grappled with, and sort of thinking about what does what does inclusive leadership look like if I'm sort of role modeling that? Basically, because it took me a while to feel comfortable to consider myself as a leader. It sort of crept up on me. I've been 18 years in the energy sector. I had a whole life of things that I did, traveling, backpacking and exploring before all of that. And then I was like, hang on, what? When did I actually become that person? Because I am still the same person. And I think it's that point of going, I'm not a finished product. I never feel like I am done or I've actually done everything perfectly. And part of that is because I'm my own worst critic. And I can be great at coaching others, but I'm terrible at necessarily like giving myself a pep talk. And I realized when I came to National Grid that I had it multiple times in my career experienced imposter syndrome. And rather than sort of be nervous about it, I was like, wow, here's a phrase. This is actually something I can identify with. And then I set up different environments to then start a conversation. One of those was a lean-in circle with others. It was through the Wing network, and to sort of create that space, then talking with graduates, then also speaking recently at a Spring Forward event, which is, again, sort of talking about different leaders. And I think what I've found to be helpful for others, or at least they give me this feedback, this is again not me feeling comfortable myself, is showing that vulnerability in leadership is very different from perhaps the old school way of doing things that, you are the perfect leader and you must follow all of my commands and I know everything, I'm omnipotent, or omnipresent of everything, I can do everything, and and don't question me. And I think that is different now. It's sort of saying that actually, by showing vulnerability, sometimes shows strength, because it then says, I can see where we want to get to, but I don't quite know how to do that just now. And I'm going to tap into the geniuses of others. So that's the type of thing I try to do when leading my team and in all those environments, to say, look, feel comfortable in your skin, feel comfortable in yourself, and realize that you bring value. It was not luck that got you here. My career has been non-linear, but that's also great. And now when I track it back, I can see, it was sort of a pathway. I just didn't know where it would unfold. And I think that what gives me optimism for the future is I don't know where it will unfold, but I know what I'm passionate about. And I think that passion drives something useful to others, and that vulnerability can show strength.
Cool. Thank you, Abbie. Josh, you've got an inclusive leadership story.
Yeah, I look at this through the lens of the journey that we've had with Pride Energy. So we've been going for 8 years, and looking at the support that I've had and the network has had from some really, really inclusive leaders across the sector. I think we have a number of very vocal people in senior roles, whether in business or trade associations or even government as well, who have been real champions for us. One is you, Rob. I remember back in the day when you were off jump, so I'll spare blushes there a bit. But I think there's a couple that we've had very recently. So I think, we look at like Lauren Slade at ENA, Nick Waith at the Energy Institute. They've been great champions for us. I think also the work that Barbara Best did with us right at the beginning, I think, was instrumental. So she was the Director of Generation at Energy UK when I worked there. And Pride Energy happened in part because of her. Like I had a one-to-one with her because she was my boss. And I said, all my friends have got these great networks. They're all like lawyers or work in housing or whatever. They've got these great networks, do loads of stuff. And she kind of went, well, why don't you do one then? Because we were 2-3 years into the Young Energy Professionals Forum at that point. And she's like, well, we've got precedent, kind of get cracking, pull together a paper. She took it to the board. It got resounding approval, and kind of like 8 years later, we've had kind of incremental development, and more people have supported us along the way. The other one that I like outside of that, and it's something I saw on LinkedIn yesterday, actually. Dara Vai is also Energy UK. She's been a big champion for our work, but she talks a lot about inclusivity. She's a woman of colour in the sector, a very senior woman of colour, and she did a big post about some of the far right protests that we saw at the weekend, and what that means for kind of like her and for her colleagues, and basically encouraging people to stand up for what they believe in and check in on people to make sure that they're okay, frankly, in that kind of environment. So yeah, that's probably give me about 10 there, but yeah, I think we're very beneficial. We benefit from a fairly large cohort of senior leaders who champion inclusivity.
And I love the story about Barbara and giving you the permission to set it up. It's just a real example of what you were talking about before, Juergen, about that kind of top-down you signal the permission, you create the ability to have this groundswell bottom up.
And for anyone who knows Barbara, it was done in a very characteristic way, where she shrugged and went, "Well, go on with it then, like go and, go and do it."
Awesome. Cordi, you got
I do a
story
quick
to tell about inclusive. Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to say, how it felt when I felt included, and that was a guy who I still remain friends with, who I worked for a long time ago in the 90s, called Earthen Menon, and he was head of Accord Energy Trading. And I was still wearing my pinstripe suit and my cufflinks. And I'd read the sports pages, obviously, because I was going to an all-male meeting, which was about 16 years of my life. And I think the challenge was just being able to speak. And it sounds so ridiculous, having the ideas and thoughts, but is there any space here? And he stopped the conversation to invite me in. And so there was the welcoming act of, Cordi, we want to hear from you. And then it was the supportive statement of, I think she'll have some new ideas or opinions that we should hear. And it was just that very single, small act. And I was like, wow, okay, better make it count what I say next. But it just felt good. And I thought, I want to pay that forward in every aspect that I can. I don't want anybody to feel like they've had to do all that preparation to then worry if they'll even have a voice today.
Yeah.
So it's that act of feeling it that motivates me, and having felt that act of kindness and support, then you can mirror that, right? And you pay it forward. And then so for me, I have the privilege of leading a really large business, one that we acquired only 3 years ago. So quite a different start point on all of these topics, actually, than National Grid Group. And it's my privilege then to be able to top down create the momentum that you talked about in Siemens, which is, we didn't have a diverse representation of leadership for our communities. We do now. Through a restructure where we access the broadest talent pools for the strategy and the business challenge ahead of us. We've launched all of our ERGs that didn't exist 2 years ago. I made a very deliberate decision where we said, what's really important to this business going forward? And we launched the Big Work campaign. There were 3 big things that we talk about all the time now. We're big on safety, we're big on customer, we're big on respect. And there was this really important singular message for me, because we're in a culture of catch up, actually, for something that I admire and love about Grid, which is what we do really matters, and how we do it is equally as important. We're on a different stage of the journey, but I guess the privilege of being a senior leader is you can set the top-down tone for inclusivity, and you can support and enable the mechanisms that start to build the groundswell. So that's how I see it. But it's that act of kindness and feeling good. You just pay it forward, and many, many brilliant things can happen.
Yeah. Your story has reminded me about the power of individuals, and almost one of an early experience in my career when I used to work in the civil service, and I was going to Brussels for a couple of days to go and engage in negotiating something or other. And my boss at the time, and I literally was about 2 months into my career, on the Eurostar turned around and said to me, "Rob, I hope you don't mind me asking, are you gay?" I had highlights at the time, which probably should have been obvious, but and I was like, "Actually, Kenan, I am." And he was like, "I thought so." And he had was there for a few days, and he printed out where the gay bars were in Brussels, and just slid it across the desk. And it was really cute, but it was just so welcoming. Yeah. And it was that sense of, I hadn't come out at that point in the office, and it was just belonged. And it was just a really simple, small act of individual kindness that made me really feel part of an organisation. So with that, I think we might have time for just one final quick question, which is on that theme of the impact we can all have as individuals. So it's what one thing would you say to people to think about doing to build belonging in their organisation, whether you're in the room next door or joining us on the line? So one bit of advice for us to do as individuals to build belonging. Juergen, I'll come to you first.
Thank you. I was just reflecting on your that piece of paper that was maybe all the gay bars, and you'd think, actually, I've already been to all of them. I mean, look, it's just been wonderful sitting here listening to all of you, and genuinely, you know, all of you working at National Grid, you're so lucky to have, you know, such tremendous leadership as I've witnessed from around the table today. So around this panel today, and that leads me to the thing to take away from this, which is to say, look, you know, we as the more inclusive leaders who get this agenda, we are so lucky, because, you know, not just do we help create the, you know, the right outcomes, the better outcomes, but, you know, we get more fulfillment out of it. You know, and I tell you what's interesting, whenever I now speak to people, I've left Siemens for 5 or 6 years now. As a matter of fact, I'm going tonight to a leaving event to one of my colleagues who, like me, had spent over 30 years at Siemens. And when people recount stories to me, it's never a story about, can you remember that quarter when we, our EBITDA was, you know, 12.5%, you know. It was never about, can you remember, you know, when you thumped the table and you told us we must improve, you know, our performance by, you know, that's not what people remember you for. People remember you for the times when you created empathy, when you stuck up for people who were less representative. Can you remember when in public, you know, you stuck up for me when some horrible manager was reprimanding me and you stuck up for me? That's what I remember about Juergen. And, you know, and it's, you know, and it's sort of, you know, just having pride in that. And the counter to that is, I just feel sorry for the people who are now emerging again as the sort of the, you know, the alpha, you know, anti-change, you know, individual, you know, I mean, in 10 or 20 years time, you know, when they are more reflective about what they're doing, I suspect they're going to look back and be pretty sad about what they didn't achieve. So, you know, so I think, you know, we just keep motivating ourselves, have more discussions like this, and it's hugely motivating. You know, we're on the right side of history.
Great. Josh, what advice for people joining us on Building Belonging?
Yeah, so I think if we look at like the key takeaway from our survey this year, it was about visibility of leadership. And I think it's important to think of all of ourselves, regardless of how senior you are within your organization or business, as being leaders. And for everyone to use whatever platform they have, whether it is, you know, running one of the biggest utilities in the country, or, you know, running a small team, or just posting something on your own LinkedIn, like whatever it is, champion issues like this, but also, you know, women's inclusivity and support people of colour and support people across the whole spectrum in whatever way you can. And the more you do it and the more you talk about it, the more it becomes, you know, a positive, inclusive working environment for all.
Cool. Thank you, Josh. Abbie?
Well, I think it's about connection. Right? We work in teams, we work on teams. In fact, we spend most of our time just staring at a screen and looking at multiple different small square boxes across the screen. And I think sometimes that can be quite draining. I joined National Grid during the pandemic, so it took me close to 14 months to actually meet my team in person, which was hard. And then I think, so why is somebody actually joining a call and then not speaking up? Why are they not actually invited into the conversation? Are we creating this space? Are they there just purely to listen and be passive, or are they there to contribute and connect with us on a topic? And I think there are some little things that we can actually all do. And I think coming back to that point, my reflection is getting to the point I'm now comfortable as a leader, or others seeing myself as a leader and myself, is that everyone has an opportunity to role model. And you have different spaces which perhaps feel a bit safer, but just saying, oh, what's your thoughts on this? And that means inviting a graduate. That means inviting someone who doesn't always like to go first, but if they're left to be the last person to speak, there's not much left to say. So it's creating those little moments. And I think then that helps with that inclusion of the examples that you gave. And those are things that we can all do. So, you know, if you go onto a call and you see that there was a whole list of people who aren't saying anything, either think, well, is this the most productive use of our time, or how can we tap into their thoughts? It might be that they contribute in a Teams chat, but then you say, that's a really good point. Would you mind just elaborating? And I think that invites others to be able to participate. Through that connection, we will be able to come up with things that are better.
I love a really practical idea that we could all think about doing about how we make kind of day-to-day meetings as inclusive as possible. Cordi.
I don't know how to follow all of that. It's just all been so brilliant. The one thing I always say to myself and to others if they want to hear it, but is be kind and brave in equal measure. I think there is, if we can be kind, we can be curious, we can think about others as much as ourselves and the situations we're in. And if we're brave, we can stand by our values, and they are always tested in the worst moments. And that's when you should speak up and stand up for what you value and believe in. So be kind and brave in equal measure, and hopefully you've got a little bit of guts in the moment, but you've got a much broader horizon when you're thinking about your team, their environment, what they need.
Cordi, thank you. Thank you. I think that draws us to a close for the session this morning. But before we all disappear, Juergen, thank you very much for joining us and giving us your time and sharing a really inspirational story of inclusive leadership. And as another gay man, having more role models is truly inspirational. It really is. And thank you to my National Grid colleagues, to Josh, to Abbie, and to Cordi for your time this morning. Let's all take that story of inspiration, bravery, kindness into our workplaces as we go forward and create places where everybody can thrive. So thank you, everyone. If we just thank the panel.